But when I heard Janet's first reading of the story in the gospel about the woman, it reminded me of Caroline, because Caroline is one of the most powerful women in the memory of my growing up. She was a Sunday school teacher when I was 4. She followed me all through my life. She was at my confirmation. She was at my ordination. And she sat in the congregation at fellowship many times. And she always referred to me as her boy. One time I thought about writing a book. And the book was called Looking Back to See Ahead. And I did research for the book. And I asked people who were in their 70s and 80s 3 questions. What was the most fun you ever had in your life? What was the worst thing that ever happened to you? And what advice have you got for somebody who's about halfway down the road that you have already traveled? So I thought Caroline would be a good resource person. So I said, Caroline, what's the worst thing ever happened to you? Well, she said, when I was young, I was kind of loose. I said, Caroline, I didn't ask you what the worst thing that you ever did was. I asked you what the worst thing that ever happened to you was. Oh, that's different. Her daughter died, and that was awful for her. Anyway, I'm wondering, after I hear that story again, if Caroline's love for people, and especially me, didn't come because she realized that she had been forgiven so much. That's all I wanted to say about that. Now, turning to the sermon for today, for a while, David was an arrogant, proud king. His armies were strong. His wealth was great. His power made him think he could have whatever he wanted. And so when he saw Bathsheba, the beautiful wife of Uriah, he took her. He impregnated her. And then he had her husband killed. This was the same young, promising shepherd boy who had killed Goliath, who had been chosen to replace Saul as king and leader of God's people. Well, he did grow up. He became a powerful king, and he let his power go to his head. And he took up with Bathsheba, as I said, and had her husband, which just wasn't her husband, but one of David's most loyal soldiers, killed. It's hard to make that story more tragic than it was. It's hard to believe that a person could be that selfish. But that is the story of David. That is, until Nathan. Nathan also was one of David's most loyal supporters and his courageous advisor. Nathan told that story about a rich man who had many flocks of his own, many lambs of his own, and a guest arrived at his house for dinner, and he needed a lamb, but he didn't want to take one of his own, so he took the poor man's one and only pet lamb and served it as a meal for his guest. Well, that story Nathan told got to David's heart. The unfairness of the story made David very angry. And the sentence that he thought should be was death to the rich man, and the poor man should receive 4 lambs to replace the one he'd lost. And the reason given out of David's own mouth is because he had no pity, no mercy, no compassion, no ability to identify with the plight of the poor man. And then Nathan spoke the words that most of us remember and shudder, I think, to hear them. Nathan said, the guy that you're mad at is you. You are the man. This is what you did. And David hung his head and began to cry. And what was redemptive about David was his acknowledgement of his sin, his refusing to make any defense, and he admitted that he let God and his people down, and faced up to his public humiliation. God saw David's heart, and God allowed David to live. And then going on to becoming the best king that Israel ever had. It's the story of horrible sin and unbelievable forgiveness and redemption. David's anger at that rich man who turned out to be himself was because, and I'll say it again, the rich man had no pity. He had no compassion. He had no mercy. And I think people like that do make those of us who have a heart for God just as angry. One added note here is that David had to live with the consequences of his actions. His infidelity caused trouble in his family forever. And of course, the child died. I have often said, and the older I get, the more I believe, nobody gets away with anything. And if you think you know somebody that did, just wait. Nobody gets away with anything. It may look like it sometimes, but they don't. Let's turn to Paul now in the second lesson. He addresses an issue that is very troubling for some. How is it that those of us who are baptized, saved by grace through faith in Jesus, read the Bible on a regular basis, study the words of Jesus, come to church often, and yet continue to sin and make mistakes? Aren't we supposed to be above that? How is it that what we believe is in us, and yet we go on as if it isn't? I cringe every time I hear about a person who has committed a crime, who has surprised the whole community because he was a regular church-going person. As if going to church makes any of us unable to sin anymore. I cringe when I hear that. You know, he was a good church-going person. Well, I know people that believe that. And they seem to be people who now have credentials to look down their noses at everyone they don't think is saved. Some of those folks I liked better before they got saved. And that saved is in quotation marks. Saved. Paul is clear, and you want to know this, that the church is for sinners. Jesus blasted the Pharisees who acted like they didn't sin anymore. But Paul's words in an old translation we should have in the back of our minds every single day. The good that I would, I do not, and it's the evil that I would not that I do. Who's going to save me from this body of sin? that? The good that I would, I do not. The evil that I would not is what I do. And our only hope is the faith we have in Jesus and his ability to forgive us. Only Jesus can save us from this very human condition. And if we get that, we understand why every single Sunday we confess our shortcomings and leave here going out to give it another try, trusting in the forgiveness of Jesus when we mess it all up again. And what that does is make us love God all the more. Like David, we have to live with the consequences of the messes we sometimes make. But because of Jesus, we are raised up in the faith that God holds nothing against us. And we need to hear that over and over and over. My friend and mentor, Leon Oppel, often would stop people in their tracks because as a pastor, you would get to hear the complaints of a lot of members of the congregation. And whenever someone would talk to Leon complaining about the behavior or the crime or the behavior of somebody they knew, Leon would stop them in their tracks and say to the complainer, well, that's their sin. What's yours? So it's not because we are Lutheran. It's not because we Lutherans don't sin anymore that we come here. It's because we do. Finally, Jesus noticed the Pharisee Jesus noticed the Pharisee who had invited him was looking down his nose at both he and the woman. And like Nathan's story to David, Jesus told this story to the Pharisee. David was convicted in Nathan's story. Simon was convicted in Jesus' story. One guy owed a man $50. Another owed him $500. The man forgave both debts. Which one would love him more? Well, of course, the Pharisee said, the one who owed him more. Then Jesus reminded him, he, the Pharisee, had not been so nice to Jesus. But the woman had humbled herself and took care of his dirty feet and honored him greatly. Her sins that were many were forgiven. She loved, and because of that, she loves greatly. But the one, I like this line, the one who has been forgiven little has little love to give. The point is arrogance, looking down on others, thinking we are better than others, stifles our ability to love. And because it becomes acute when we think that we are someone who doesn't sin anymore, the ability to look down your nose at people becomes acute when you think and believe that you are someone who doesn't sin anymore. And because we know we do, we lean on Jesus. David's anger was kindled because the rich man in Nathan's story had no pity, no compassion, no sympathy for the poor man. I challenge you to get angry like that too. Paul wants us to know that because we are good Christians does not mean any of us are perfect. And we all need to rely on the redemption that we have in Jesus. And Jesus cautions us seriously, severely in this gospel lesson against becoming Pharisee-like, more interested in judging others than taking a good hard look at ourselves.